Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Command Sergeant Major Christopher Donaldson, the JMRC Ops Group Sergeant Major, and I have with me today Colonel Jennifer Gurney from the Joint Trauma System, and we're going to talk a little bit today about casualties in a LISCO environment. So, Colonel Gurney, first of all, thank you all for being here today and taking the time to discuss some of these topics that is a big thing going into a LISCO environment with a casualty. So.
Well, seriously, thank you, and thanks for your team and the time that they gave us today. I learned a lot from talking to your group. You have a group of highly motivated 2-4s, I guess you call them, and so thanks for inviting us out here. It's really excellent. And it sets an example of how leadership, senior leadership like yourself, and wanted to thank you and Colonel Kirkpatrick for the invitation and for letting the Joint Trauma System team work with you guys and really recognizing the importance of casualty care, especially in a LISCO environment.
Okay. So I guess the first question I'll ask, when you talk with soldiers and leaders, there's a lot of words thrown out there: prolonged field care, prolonged casualty care. What is really the difference in the definition of both of those?
Okay, yeah, it's a great question, and there is confusion about it. And so, and I want to start by saying that the guys that really started this, I mean, they should get the credit for prolonged field care. That started in the soft community, and it was recognizing the extended timelines that in the COIN environment that pre-hospital, Role 1, medics, other providers had to maintain casualties. And those skills for prolonged field care are really at the soft medic or Tier 4, Tier 3 and Tier 4 TC3. Prolonged casualty care is something that the Joint Trauma System and the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care and the Prolonged Casualty Care Working Group, which is made up of a bunch of PCC providers and, from medics, physicians, nurses that have defined like this prolonged casualty care. So prolonged casualty care is a environment where you don't have the resources, you don't have evacuation, and medics and non-medics, I think that's an important part, non-medics, so people like you, are going to be taking care of casualties in a resource-constrained environment without evac. So prolonged field care has really evolved to be more the soft community, and prolonged casualty care is for all pre-hospital providers. But then so when someone says, we want to do research investment for prolonged casualty care at the Role 3, that's like not using the term right. Prolonged care will be at the Role 3. So I know it's complicated, but I think the main concept is that in a contested, constrained, large-scale combat operation environment, at every role of care along our entire battlefield continuum, casualties will be backed up, Role 1, Role 2, surgical care, en route care, and then so really how do we adjust our mindset, our doctrine, our training, how we organize, how we equip for being in a contested environment. Contested logistics, we talk about that all the time, but it's also congested logistics and congested evacuation. So prolonged casualty care applies to Role 1, a non-regulated medical system, so hasn't moved into a medically regulated system, and it's providing care for traumatically injured or sick, other military health threats, but mostly traumatically injured before they reach the Role 2 environment or get into the medically regulated environment. Did that make sense?
No, absolutely, and thank you for delineating that. Like I said, there's so much confusion out there, and it's one of those questions you always ask, and people don't really know what the difference is, so thank you for laying that out.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
So I think my next question, we're looking at everything coming out of Russia and Ukraine with lessons learned and a lot with the technology, but I think one thing we need to really start paying more attention to is some of the medical lessons learned. So what do you think are some of the biggest medical lessons learned, and how can we get after that as far as the training aspect of it?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Or you wouldn't have asked it. But so, we have a lot, we've learned a lot. And I just want to say that the Ukrainians, I've had the chance, as many of us had, to work with Ukrainian medical providers side by side, and they are extremely generous about sharing their lessons learned. So grateful for that. We've also been able to talk to a lot of people who have been to Ukraine and who have observed it firsthand. And, I think we all recognize, and if we don't, you need to recognize that what they're seeing in Ukraine with large-scale combat is large-scale combat operations, and we need to be learning everything we can And so tactically, operationally, and certainly medically. The drone warfare, that's going to be real. The future fight is going to be observed. It's going to be, drones are going to be involved. We need to get smart on how to have counter drone measures and then how to optimize drones for other things to facilitate evacuation, to facilitate care. It's scary, honestly. I mean, what we see, some of the footage that we've seen from both Russia and Ukraine about what these drones can do, how medical teams are forced to operate. The Red Cross is considered the Dread Cross, medical teams being targeted. These are things we don't have experience with, and so every opportunity we can learn from the Ukrainians, and Ukrainian medical teams have been very generous with what they shared. But here's some of the things. So what are we used to? We're used to bombs from below. In the future, it's going to be bombs from above, drone attacks. And, the FPVs and UAS, like all these things, injuries, they're seeing more injuries in the head and neck. We don't have great body armor for the head, neck, and face. Still, the main cause of death is hemorrhage. TBI is ubiquitous. These are some of the lessons that we've learned. Evacuation is prolonged. We've learned so much from the Ukrainians with how they've adopted tourniquet use. So in our trauma system, and something I say all the time, and I don't think people always understand it, but I'm going to try and explain it quickly. The trauma system has a say. So what was our trauma system in the GWAT and CENTCON operations? Rapid evac, small medical footprint, lots of medical capability, lots of helicopters. And so we were getting casualties to the next level of care really quickly. So in the pre-hospital environment, if everyone got a tourniquet, okay, because they were going to get to a Roll 2 surgical team usually within an hour and get that tourniquet converted. Risk of that is very low. In an environment with prolonged evacuation, using tourniquets unnecessarily has risk to limb and risk to life. And so we've learned a lot from the Ukrainians about the importance of better selection for who needs a tourniquet. And we've been trying to put out some education from the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care and the Joint Trauma System on who needs a tourniquet, because prolonged tourniquet use is bad. Unnecessary tourniquet use is bad, but we didn't have that bad because we were always able to get tourniquets off, really quickly. So we've learned a lot from them, and we've adopted our Tactical Combat Casualty Care guidelines. Really increased education, like we talked about earlier today. There's training to put on a tourniquet. That's like kind of a technical skill. But then education, understanding who needs a tourniquet, the risk of prolonged tourniquet use, how to convert a tourniquet, how to pack a wound. So that's a huge lesson learned from the Ukrainians. Injury patterns, evacuation, the importance of blood far forward, and then the risk to medical teams. Medical teams are targeted. If our medical teams don't have tactical training on how to protect themselves, how to move underground, how to seek cover, how to not be a risk to the operational force, then not only will we not be able to take care of patients because we're going to get ourselves killed, but we're going to be a risk to you guys and be a liability. So that's another thing, the importance of tactical training and teams protecting. And you know what? We're not there yet. We've been talking about it. The Joint Trauma System's been talking about it for the better part of a decade, about the need for this training, and we're slowly getting the services to a joint education and training curriculum for austere resuscitative surgical care. Was that too long of an answer?
No,
Okay.
that was great.
Okay.
It really gets after everything that's coming out, and there's so much trying to analyze all that and take that data, and where we need to change some of our doctrine
yeah.
and how we train these things.
Data. Can I talk about data for a second?
Absolutely.
That's another thing we've learned from the Ukrainians. So they're working really hard to be a data-driven trauma system. So, and we were not, when we went into CENTCOM, we were not a data-driven trauma system. It took us a while to understand the importance of data. So Ukrainians have multiple efforts to set up trauma registries so they can have a cycle of act, you take care of patients, learn from what you write down and what you document, and then adjust. That's how we've learned stuff about tourniquets and what they've been doing with blood and their injury patterns. And I want to thank them again. I think it's really important to acknowledge the great, incredible work that the Ukrainians have done and their willingness to share their lessons learned with us, and so give us a chance to learn to get better.
No, absolutely agree. It's changing how we look at medicine.
Absolutely.
And
It totally
everything
is.
with the casualties. You talked a little bit about it with the evacuation. with how the Army's going right now with the R-Struck and TIC, we're starting to get lighter and getting rid of some of the platforms. How do you really see that going with the casualty evacuation piece in the LESCO environment?
Not well. No, so we have, so there's like this paradox between we need to get lighter to have maneuverability, but we also need to have capability, which requires weight and cue, which is not getting lighter. And that goes back, and that we can see that, in the surgical environment too. We know we need to get lighter, but if you want to have more of a capability, you need more. So how do we do more with less, and how do we stay agile and tactical? That is going to be really difficult in the en route care environment, and moving patients. We're going to have to be flexible, and we're going to have to adapt. So I think if you said, what's the most important thing we could do now? It would be training and education. We need to get our providers at all levels, medics, physicians, nurses, and non-medical people, to understand what we need to do to evacuate patients. This idea of like CASEVAC and in Ukraine, non-medical people taking care of casualties and moving them, that's going to be a reality. Any platform, we need to be trained to be platform agnostic. So right now we've got medevac providers, we've got fixed wing providers with AeroVac and CCAP providers. We have ship providers. We need to have medical personnel, medics, through the entire, all healthcare providers, to be platform agnostic. You need to be able to do that care on any, whether it's a train, a car, a vehicle, a unmanned vehicle. Like that care needs to be able to be performed on any platform. The other thing is, what was I going to say? I'm blanking on what I was going to say. Platform agnostic. Oh, and education. So providers need to be educated. We can't take medics or physicians, but I'm going to focus on medics that are motor pool medics, and say, go ahead and do this care. They need to be educated. Experience saves lives. So getting medics into hospitals, into MILSIF partnerships, into trauma centers, on ride-alongs from the ER, that is absolutely critical. And then the last thing about en route care, and really our entire battlefield trauma system, and whether that's in a LISCO fight, that's in an Indo-PACOM environment or land environment, our medical capability needs to be able to aggregate and disaggregate. We need to be mobile, and we need to be able to come together and have more of a capability, and then we need to be able to disaggregate. That's going to give us that agility to be able to adapt to whatever the need is. In order to come together and break apart, everyone needs to know their job, and they can't just be okay at it. They've got to be good at it. And our jobs are clinical, right? So, I save lives by operating on patients, transfusing patients, doing the care. Medic saves lives by, TC3 principles, blood transfusion. If we're not good at our jobs clinically, if we don't have experience, then the tactical environment, the tactical training won't matter as much. So it's got to be both. And I think, I think everybody recognizes this. It's not like secret. We're behind on that. We're behind on getting everybody enough experience, and we're behind on our tactical training. But the future battlefield, our ability to perform as a medical system will be, can we adapt and be agile? Do we have redundancy of capability? And do we have skills? And we get our skills from training and experience.
Well, a lot of the points you're bringing up, it's one thing that we see almost every rotation with the brigades is in that planning process. Like, we got to start looking at how we do our casualty evacuation in that type of environment that I don't think we always put that much time and effort into it. And we really got to see the brigades think through some of those resources. Yeah. With the limited capabilities that we have. So if we're not thinking about that in the planning process going into a mission, I think that's one thing that is definitely lacking that we really got to start thinking through a little bit more.
Yeah, and what you guys do at JMRC and really all the CTCs, the more realistic training we have, the more we can inject reality, good simulation, real MASCAL training, involving command elements, not having medical being like its own little pocket, doing its own thing, really integrated, using documentation tools so we're data driven, all those things. Those transformations, that happens at the training centers. And, if we have to figure this out on the next battlefield, we're going to not be very happy with our case fatality rate. And like we talked about earlier today, a failed casualty response system will impact every warfighting function. Every warfighting function will be impacted if casualty response fails and we have a large number of deaths from survivable injuries on the battlefield.
So we're talking prolonged field care and casualty care a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
One thing I saw as a brigade sergeant major was the lack of 68 whiskeys in my brigade, and it's an Army problem. So how do we really get after training those 11 series, the 13s, the 19s that are going to be up there on the float to do some of these things in order to save lives right up before we can even get them back? We got to take care of them on the float. So
Yeah.
how do we train some of the other MOSs that aren't 68 series?
Yeah, I feel like you set me up for that. The guys on the Prolonged Casualty Care Working Group and Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care, it's like they told you to ask that question.
Not at all.
So we have guidelines for that. The second revision of the Prolonged Casualty Care guidelines are coming out. And a big part of prolonged casualty care is the 11 Bravo, the non-medical people taking care or augmenting the 68 whiskey. So I want to say something that's controversial, and people will probably like throw eggs at their screen or whatever if they're watching this, but prolonged casualty care is not really a capability. It's a gap.
Mm-hmm.
It's a capability gap. When you can't move a casualty rapidly in a timely fashion and provide all the capability that you need to save lives. So how do we augment? I mean, that's what you're asking. How do we close that gap? Well, closing that gap is, well, one, as many 68 whiskeys as we can. I mean, obviously it's a shortage, and we should try and mitigate that. We should try and make it less of a shortage. But then training the non-medical personnel to be able to augment the medic. And that's what the prolonged casualty care guidelines will get after. We'll never, in my opinion, without like a lot of AI and telehealth, which might be the future, which will be the future, but like right now, we can't run an ICU run by medics in a tactical environment. It's like, that's kind of magical thinking. But we can do the basics of TC3, so everyone should be trained. And when you told me earlier today that, how the lack of TC3 training of the units rotating, like, we must do better. Like, TC3 is the basics, and 100% of people that come through here should be TC3 trained. And honestly, commanders should be held accountable for that. So TC3, the basics, and then so that's where everybody starts. And then the prolonged casualty care guidelines go into how non-medical providers can augment 68 whiskeys or could essentially bystander care. In LISCO, people will die. We'll have a much higher case fatality rate than we did in COIN, and we have to be realistic about that. I hope we never see LISCO, but like if we do, we're not going to be, high-fiving about how well we've done from saving lives on the battlefield. People will die from survivable injuries, and we'll do everything we can. And the TC3 guidelines, prolonged casualty care guidelines, everything we can do to augment evacuation, blood far forward. We talked a ton about that today. The importance of transfusion as far forward as possible. So in COIN and GWAT, we brought the casualty to the capability, and what we're realizing, that's why I mentioned aggregated, disaggregated, we're going to need to bring the capability to the casualty. And you mentioned that earlier, that your mindset was changing about what LISCO looks like for medical care.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the conversation we had earlier today, we talk about the golden hour and all that going away because it was a GWAT thing, and something that was completely eye-opening today that I didn't even think about was the golden hour isn't going away.
Right.
We need to think about it differently, right?
Yeah,
the golden hour is that
totally
that life-saving time
Right.
that we still need to do it. It just doesn't mean that casualty is going to be evacuated in that first hour.
For sure. And I didn't even realize until then you saw it on the slide too, when the golden hour goes away. So we think of the golden hour in CENTCOM as a helicopter. You guys said that, we think, but as a surgeon, the golden hour term goes back. It's about physiology, casualty physiology. When people die, people who have bad injuries and are bleeding to death, so we're talking about hemorrhage, if they're bleeding to death, they die within an hour. That's a golden hour. They might die within 30 minutes. Actually, our studies show that transfusion before 36 minutes has a fourfold increase in 24-hour survival. So that's not really an hour, that's 36 minutes. So is it an hour? Is it 30 minutes? But the golden hour to us, as medical providers, is a physiology. We have not changed physiology. Physiology is physiology. We're working on it. There's drugs in the pipeline, and there are golden hour extenders. Whole blood is a golden hour extender. Could Reboa be a golden hour extender? Studies are coming out. Freeze-dried plasma or dried plasma, golden hour extenders. So those are things that will give that, but it's not the golden hour how you were seeing it as kind of an operational thing. When the helicopter gets there, that is going away, but the golden hour physiologically stays. So the golden hour stays for physiology. The golden hour goes away for helicopters. We got to find a way to say that to market it so people
Yes.
understand
Absolutely.
the difference.
Like I said, that was eye-opening today, having that conversation, and I think we all saw that a little bit differently, whether it's how we grew up and just over the last 20 years in the GWAP, but it was that was moving talking about that today and seeing how the maneuver guys see that differently than the
They
medical.
see it as helicopter, yeah. And I think medical still see it too. I mean, we still see it as a golden hour. I mean, there was a golden hour policy, the Gates memo that said you have to arrive at a surgical capability within 60 minutes. And that's a goal. I mean, that's a goal, but that goal will not be attainable during LISCO. We know that. We're learning that from Ukraine. The golden hour of evacuation goes away, the golden hour of physiology. We need a lingo for that so people can get it.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
So, talking the whole blood, that's something we're really trying to change and incorporate into the CTCs. How do you reward units that are actually pushing this so that we can get after these life-saving things? So how do you think that we can best incorporate the whole blood and walking blood banks in a CTC environment?
Well, I want to credit Lieutenant Colonel Max Ferguson for coming up with some ideas for that. The commanders should be graded on their ability to, that their formations are able to transfuse blood. Blood transfusion is a life-saving capability. It is data-driven, proven over and over again. Far forward blood saves lives. So if people are going to invest in something, it's how do we get that capability far forward, and how do we empower medics and train medics to be able to give blood far forward. And when we talk about whole blood far forward, there's blood from the walking blood bank, which we're finalizing the Joint Trauma System Valkyrie walking blood bank training curriculum. And then there's blood provided by Armed Services Blood Program. They're both whole blood, different ways of getting it, whether you draw it on target or draw it on site, or whether it's shipped cold chain through the Armed Services Blood Program. How do we reward units for doing that? Maybe how do we punish units that don't do it? I don't know, but I mean, I think that commanders should be judged on it, and if they're able to recognize which casualties need blood and their medical formations are trained to be able to do it, they should be. I mean, that should be whatever you guys check on the box for, like the gold star for the. But not having a blood far forward plan, training, and capability is going to cost lives, and since World War I, we've been giving blood at the point of injury. So if we can't get it into the training environment and make it happen for our casualties, then we are not doing the best for those that are wounded on the battlefield.
I agree. I've seen what that capability provides and how much it makes a difference, and we got to start pushing this more. And I think the way you really get after that is at the CTCs and really pushing that training aspect to it. And that's where it all comes back to. We can say we're doing these things, but if we're not training it,
right,
we don't know what we're really doing.
And also leadership investment. I mean, between the 210, yourself, Colonel Wentz, Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson, I mean, you guys got it. And it was driven from you guys. Like, you understood it, you saw the data, and I mean, when we had the chance to look at your roll ones, every one of them, they were so organized. They had their pre-screening roster, their donor list. They knew all their typos. They knew their low titer typos, and that was driven by you guys. That was driven by you and by Colonel Wentz, and that you guys were probably the most prepared. And we've been, we follow the teams downrange, and the Joint Trauma System has been doing that, since its inception. And you guys, your preparedness was, probably the best we've ever seen.
Well,
So
I appreciate
congratulations.
that. Yeah,
No, but
I appreciate that.
it was leadership. So I mean, I think this goes to so medical can't do this without maneuver and line leadership, maneuver command line leadership. I mean, it's just not going to exist. If we're serious about saving lives and really augmenting lethality, which if you have a good medical capability, it's supports operational effectiveness and augments lethality, it really starts with you guys. It starts with you guys saying, this has to be a priority.
Okay. So I think my last question, and we'll kind of wrap this up. Is there one thing that you would like to tell, battalion commanders, brigade commanders, battalion CSMs, brigade CSMs to really focus on when it comes to medical before coming to the CTC? What do you think that one thing would really be to drive after?
Before they come to the CCC. TC, like, everyone should be trained in TC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care. They should be reviewing the prolonged casualty care training and guidelines and blood. There's so many other things. I could just keep talking about this, but people probably don't want to hear me talk about it. As you know, I can keep talking about it. But, and then role 2 surgical care. Our trauma system is a continuum. So role 1 goes to role 2 goes to role 3. It's all linked by evac. So everybody needs to be trained. But I'd say for the commanders, bringing at the battalion and brigade level, TC3 training, prolonged casualty care, guideline, familiarization, and training. But I don't want to make it seem like it's a capability, because it's a capability gap, but we do have guidelines for it, so it gets a little bit schizophrenic. And then blood training and titer testing. Everyone should be titer tested, and it's expensive. So is saving lives. We've got to figure this out. If we never go to war, we don't have to pay for any of this stuff, right? But if there's any chance that we're going to have another war, then let's invest in how we save lives. And saving lives increases operational effectiveness.
I can agree. So, Colonel Gurney, thank you so much for taking the time today. Appreciated all the conversation throughout the day, and I wish we could have talked longer and more about this. It is absolutely critical that we start educate more people on this and how we get after that. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, CSM. Thanks for your leadership.